Representative Crenshaw, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be back with you all. Still can't see y'all, so it'll be a few more weeks till that hopefully happens. I'm doing well, and you don't need to feel bad for me. We raise our right hand and then we ask to go to war, and sometimes this is what happens. But I hope to be back to normal within a couple months. But for now, even a blind knuckle dragger can do a hearing. So here I am, and let's get to work. Administrator Regan, thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations on your new position. So I do have some questions. You've said that in your budget proposal, about 8% of the EPA's budget will be used for environmental justice. And as you put it, rewriting the DNA of the EPA. Hoping you can tell us what you mean by that. How do you attach dollars to the notion of implementing environmental justice?
Well, thank you for that question, Congressman, and thank you for your service to this country. Environmental justice and equity will be part of the EPA's DNA. And what I mean by that is there are areas that we can bolster our efforts to be sure that communities that have had the disproportionate impact from pollution no longer suffer disproportionately. And so there are opportunities for us to take a look at overburdened communities to ensure that we have the appropriate air quality monitoring in place, that when we look at water quality needs from an infrastructure standpoint, that many of those communities have good quality drinking water, lead service lines and pipes that are disproportionately impacting communities.
Administrator, since I have limited time, I think your answer so far is fairly reasonable, to be honest with you. That's fine. Thank you for defining that. The concern I have is certain legislation that may be written into law that you would have to then regulate. The Clean Futures Act, for instance, in Section 601, defines environmental justice rather differently than you just did. It defines it based on 17 principles from the 1991 People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. Among some of these principles, it states that we must affirm the sacredness of Mother Earth. I'm not sure what that means. It's a bit paganistic. Another principle would say that we must oppose the destructive operations of all multinational corporations. So my question would be, does that make sense to write something like that into law? It's one thing for activists to be saying that kind of rhetoric. It's quite another for that to be written into law, which your agency would have to then regulate. How on earth would you do that?
Well, and thank you for the question. I'm not familiar with that piece of legislation, so I'm not quite sure I can fully answer your question. I think any piece of legislation, we'd like to be sure that, number one, it follows the law, and we have the authority to actually execute on what is being asked of us. Okay. So I'll take a look at that, but not familiar with it.
Well, thank you, Administrator. I do find it a little hard to believe that you haven't seen that piece of legislation. It's a flagship bill for your party, and it would directly influence everything you do at the EPA. Along the same lines, in Title IX of the Clean Future Act, it effectively bans plastic for the next 10 years, at least puts a pause on it, with the promise of burdensome regulations right after that. Effectively curtailing any kind of investment in new plastic production in the United States. We have some of the best natural gas resin-based plastic production. So the problem is this: there's opposing forces here. On the one hand, the Biden administration wants to implement an enormous infrastructure plan that will require massive new plastic production, whether it's building EV batteries, lightweight materials for EV cars, new syringes and biomedical devices and syringes which we use to vaccinate people, thousands of miles of fiber optic cable wrapped in plastic. But this would be banned, on the other hand, and your agency would be tasked to effectively ban that according to the law. So what would we do?
Well, I want to be clear, honest, and transparent with you. Number one, I'm unfamiliar with the piece of legislation, have not been briefed by my team, which sends a signal to me that it may not be high on our priority. So I'm not in a position to address many of those questions. This is the first time I'm hearing of it.
Okay, Administrator Regan, you're saying that no one has consulted with you. You're the expert. You're the head of the EPA, but no one has consulted with you about the Clean Futures Act.
That's exactly what I'm telling you.
Okay. Well, thank you. No further questions, Mr. I can't see my time, so maybe I'm over time, and if I am, thank you for allowing me. If not, I yield back.